Would you turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Revelation, chapter 18? And I want to begin by reading the first 19 verses of that chapter. And if you're able and willing, could you stand with me as we read this passage together? John the prophet is writing, and he says, "After this I saw another angel." It's interesting, 7 times John says, "Then there was another angel." After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, and he had great authority. And the earth was illuminated by his splendor. And with a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home of demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth have committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." And then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Mix her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, 'I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and I will never mourn.' Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand afar off and cry, 'Woe, woe, O great city, O Babylon, city of power. In 1 hour your doom has come.' The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice and incense and myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil and of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and bodies and souls of men. They will say, 'The fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your riches and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered.' And the merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand afar off, terrified at her torment. And they will weep and mourn and cry out, 'Woe, woe, O great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off. And when they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, 'Was there ever a city like this great city?' They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, 'Woe, woe, O great city, where all who had ships in the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin.'" Let's begin with prayer. Father, I ask that as we continue looking at the signs of the times which we believe we are living in, that you would give us insight and understanding. That God, it would become so clear to us that you have not created us to be just simply residents of time, but you've created us to reside with you for eternity. Transform our understandings and move our hearts to hope for eternal things and not simply what we can gain and acquire in this brief moment of time called our life in this world. Grant us your wisdom and grace, your discernment, Father, we pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen. You may be seated. Last week we talked about the mark of the beast, and really it was kind of a micro look at the economy of the end times. And basically focusing on how that could be facilitated in your and my day-to-day life. But today we're going to pull back, and instead of having that micro view, we're going to kind of take a macro view. And particularly, I want to talk about something that sounds, at least on the surface, incredibly boring. I hope it isn't. But I want to talk about the international banking syndicate that really controls the flow of money around the world to a degree that most of us do not understand. More powerful than governments, more powerful than the laws that governments pass, or armies that they send into the fields to fight their battles. Someone once said, don't buy a gun and rob a person when you can buy a bank and rob everyone. And it's, I don't mean to really kind of mock or make fun of bankers, because most people who work in the banking industry are honest, upright people who are just trying to provide a service for a fair wage. And so I'm not trying to impugn anybody's integrity. But one of the things we have to understand is Solomon once said that money is the answer to all things. In our previous references to Babylon the Great, John has described her function as a political center and a religious capital of the world. But here he begins to focus on the third dimension of her activity, and that's a financial capital of the world. That basically she becomes the consummate economic capital that the world revolves around. Now, there has long been conjecture as to what the exact identity of Babylon is. Some have said, well, it's literally Babylon, that there was a thought during the invasion of the first Gulf War that we would, see Babylon being rebuilt. In fact, Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild the old city, but nobody really considers this place in the middle of Iraqi desert to be the focal point of the end times, although we can always be surprised. Many people have identified it with various capitals, depending on who seems to be in predominance in the world at that time, whether it's Rome or it's Berlin or London or New York, or even, just as I said, literally Babylon itself. It's interesting or important to keep on mind that it says it's mystery Babylon, which the word mysterion in the Greek literally means it's hidden, it's not obvious. And maybe all of our efforts to identify it exactly will only lead to frustration, because we'll only be really clear as God unveils or makes it obvious. But at this point, if you want to pick one city in the world, past, present, or future, your guess is really quite as good as mine is. But we do know that her name is a kind of a cryptic pseudonym indicating that she shares the characteristics of the first Babylon, the original Babylon. That is, she had the characteristics of unlimited power, unlimited wealth, luxury, opulence, sensual indulgence, slavery, cruelty, decadence, and ultimately demonic control. That it really becomes the sum total of everything that's wrong with the world. It's like Satan, unfettered, is able to give full expression to his worst characteristics. But she not only shares in the dark and evil excesses of ancient Babylon, but exceeds them, which is why her admirers remark, was there ever a city like this great city? That for those who like to measure life in the metrics of money or pleasure, she becomes the ultimate expression of that. It's taking New York, Berlin, and Las Vegas and LA and scrambling all of them together in one and saying, if you want it and you have the money, you can get it, and there are no restrictions. Yet, even though it's interesting because ancient cities were always often referred to in the feminine, they were called the mother of their inhabitants. In fact, when Jesus says to the women of Jerusalem, and calls them the daughters of Jerusalem, the people in the city were often called the daughters and the sons of that particular city, being mothered by that great city. And so it was, we find Mystery Babylon is portrayed in the feminine. And yet we need to keep in mind she possesses no maternal honor, instincts, or virtues. Rather, as we read in chapter 17, that she is what the great prostitute she's called. With her, it says, the kings of the earth have committed spiritual and moral adultery, that the inhabitants of the earth are intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries and her seductions. She says she held in her hand a golden cup that was filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries, and it says, and she was drunk with the blood of the saints. Ultimately, she becomes the greatest predator upon the church in all of history. Later on, as we read today, she is the home of demons and the haunt, or literally the cage, the enclosure of every evil spirit. That this is where darkness prevails in an omnipotent way upon the earth. But what is most notable is those who mourn her demise. And that should stand out to us because when we read it's the kings of the earth, it's the merchants of the earth. In other words, it's the political and financial dons of the world who suffer the loss the greatest because they said they grew rich from her. They gained her wealth from her excessive luxuries. So it's their monetary benefit, the money that they gain and the power that comes with that money is the thing that they yearn for, miss, and mourn over. Because we're told back in chapter 6 of Revelation that the world at this time will be a world where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's put in kind of a cryptic way so we might easily miss it in our modern era. But when he says in verse 6 of chapter 6, a quart of wheat for a day's wages. A quart of wheat, you can buy it if you do the adjustment of a bushel, how many bushels or quarts are in a bushel, you realize that a quart of wheat today costs about $5. And yet he says, in that day, the average wage, which is figured around $130 a day, certainly before taxes, but $130 a day, basically, you're spending that entire amount for what once cost only a few dollars. And then he says, secondly, 3 quarts of barley, which would cost you about $20, is also sold for a day's wage. And then he says, in contradistinction, hurt not or damage not the oil and the wine, which were the goods of luxury in the ancient world. It was the wealthy who could afford the oil and the wine. And so you have this picture that he draws of us. On one hand, you have people who are living literally day to day and hand to mouth, barely surviving, and yet you have on the other end this small group of elites who live at a level of luxury and abundance that can only be dreamed of by most of the world's population. Basically, it is a world, increasingly, I would say, that's not terribly different from today. Because we live in a world where there's a staggering concentration of wealth in the hands of literally fewer and fewer individuals. In fact, according to the Guardian, basically, they said since 2008, the financial crisis, which is interesting because 2008 was where a lot of us saw a lot of our savings and retirement funds begin to disappear. You know, all of our 401ks went to 201ks, really overnight. You know, but for the wealthiest of the world, it had just the opposite effect. As they saw that they had the resources to gobble up massive parts of the global economy and come to a greater concentration, so that they said that the richest 1% have been growing, their income has been growing at a 6% a year ever since the year 2008, reaching 64% or 2/3 basically of the world's wealth by the year 2030. That less than a little more than 10 years, they'll say that 2/3 of everything that exists in the world will be owned by 1% of the world's population. Forbes went on to say that the world's economy today is controlled by 147 companies. Most of them are banks or investment institutions, hedge funds and mutual funds and that sort of nature. In other words, those whose business is money are the ones who have basically taken over most of the major corporations within the world. And when you begin to look at one company and you see whether it's a partner or part of another conglomeration, it's amazing how many of these companies have been purchased and consolidated under one simple heading or one simple fund. But it's also 10 companies, when you think about it, this is staggering to me. 10 companies produce all of the packaged food that exists in the world. 10 companies provide everything you see in the grocery shelf when you're looking at the cereals and the cocoa and all the rest of the fruit juices and all. There's 10 companies who produce all of that worldwide. Oxfam they said that only 8 people today in the world, 8 people own 50% of all the wealth on the planet. 8 people. And they are familiar. Most of them are Americans. Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world right now, of Amazon. You have Bill Gates, of course. Amancio Ortega, who is a Spanish investor who owns a company called Inditex, which is a financial firm. Warren Buffett, Carlos Slim, many of us don't know who Carlos is, but Carlos Slim is a major Mexican telecommunication giant, and he has also owned 17% of the New York Times. Mark Zuckerberg, he's number 5 in the list of wealthiest people in the world. Larry Ellison, number 10, he owns Oracle. Michael Bloomberg, who wants to be president, but he's an investment banker and also owns large portions of media, and Larry Page of Google. It's interesting because there are basically the technical guys for the most part, but all of them have this one thing in common. They have massive fortunes which they have used to cobble up and to buy up hundreds, if not thousands, of different smaller companies and corporations. But what the Bible portrays for us in Revelation and other places is a picture of men and women who are driven and controlled by what Paul described to Timothy as being the love of money. In fact, he went so far as to say, it is the root of all evil. Now, everyone except one modern translation, English translation, inserts in there all sorts or all kinds of evil, but kinds or sorts does not exist in the original text. It is literally all evil comes from the love of money. And that's because it's not really the money that they love as much as what money provides them with, something that people have always desired and know is more important than money, and that is power. That all that money is power concentrated. And if you don't think so, just open up your wallet or flash some bills and people will treat you differently. I guarantee it. Because it speaks of a kind of a power that you have, and people will treat you nicer if they think you have lots of it. This is why it says the kings, the corporate dons, and the bankers, in my opinion, mourn over the destruction of not just this city, but the system that it sustains. They refer to it as the city of power. The city of power. All the world's power emanates out from this city, and in a moment it is destroyed, and with its destruction, they too are distraught. Now, this is also why money is really the heart and soul of the one world system. As the twisted version of the golden rule says, whoever has the gold makes the rules. Excuse me. We have songs that say things like, money makes the world go round. And Solomon again said, money is the answer to all things. But maybe more to the point is that it's reported that Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who was the father, really, or the founding father of what we call international finance, he lived in about 1813, but he's reported to have said, permit me to control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes the laws. Permit me to control the money of a nation, and I don't care who makes the laws. As we see even in our own time, and we find that so many of those who are in the political class in our own country today really respond to the money. It's all about show me the money. And we may not like it. We would like to believe that the representatives that we send to represent us in our nation's capital are exempt from that, or even our state capital. But the truth of the matter is, those men really don't lead. They're at the beck and call of people who have financial wealth and ability. And if they don't play the game, they're cut off financially. And they will not be able to continue to run or hold office. So what I think we need to do is follow the advice of Deep Throat in that Watergate movie, All the President's Men, where supposedly Deep Throat, he didn't really, but in the movie he did, he says to him, follow the money. So I want to begin by asking you a very simple question, and if you've been here, you probably know the answer. But let me ask you this. What does the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rockefeller Fund, the Council in the Americas, the UN, the EU, the GATT Treaty, the WTO Treaty, World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NAFTA, TTP, what do all those things have in common? And the answer is David Rockefeller. He's nicknamed Mr. Globalist for a good reason. In fact, one biographer summarized his life this way. He says, his public facade of modesty was a disingenuous ploy. given his leadership role in shaping the landscape of global banking, his enormous influence over the formation of the European Union, and his proximity to nearly every world leader throughout his lifetime. We're talking the good, the bad, and the ugly. He had unprecedented power and access, had long gone hand in hand with his massive accumulation of wealth enjoyed by the Rockefeller dynasty. You see, David Rockefeller was just one, but certainly probably in his lifetime at the top of the clique. But he's part of an extremely wealthy clique who viewed themselves as being the hereditary elite of the world. In fact, in a Rockefeller Brothers Fund special report that they released in 1959, they made the following statement: "Some men are born to rule, but some men are born to be ruled. We cannot escape the task which history has imposed upon us, helping shape a new world order in all of its dimensions: spiritual, economic, political, and social." Now, that may sound like terrible arrogance to you, but you see, men like David Rockefeller and his likes, they look back and say, we, like the Rothschilds and other famous families around the world, we have been wealthy beyond comprehension since 300-400 years ago and even beyond. They are what we call ancient money, not just old money. They are ancient money. They have had money since that as far back as anybody can remember, and they have concluded that it's a consequence of their genetic makeup. Now, that may sound really strange to you, but when you listen to some of the less than public commentary by many of those who are part of the new elite, whether it be Elon Musk or Bezos or some of these other people, they believe that they are evolved further along the chain of evolutionary progression than the rest of us. That the reason that they are making the monies that they do and hold the positions and creating the things they're creating is because they're either chosen by some mystical spiritual force, or they themselves are just inherently further evolved than the rest of us, and therefore they have the right to rule. They have the right to control, and they also have the right not to be questioned or examined closely by the things that they do. You see, basically this media or this elite group has also always been very close to the elite media in our country. In fact, in a speech to the Bilderberger Group, easy for me to say, David Rockefeller made an amazing admission. He said, "We are grateful to the media whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the light of publicity." So in this age when people are decrying fake news, we're just getting the memo. The news has been manufactured and massaged and shaped and presented. It's been emphasized in one area and total neglect of other areas for a very long time. So that when we look at groups like the Bilderbergers, who are kind of secretive, even though they're composed of the wealthiest, most powerful, most important people on the planet by man's standard, we know nothing about their meetings, and the media who are invited to be there, whether they be from major newspapers or from major networks, or now even with people like Jeff Bezos, who is also part of their group, they have agreed that they'll keep their meetings secret and their discussions private as they make plans for reshaping the world into what they believe will be a much better place. And I agree to some degree, it'll probably be a much better place for them. But today this group includes not the top 1%. It includes the top 100th of 1% of the people in the world. It's a very small group. We're talking about someplace between 300 to 1,000 people on the planet who are part of these inner circles. What the 1% or 1.1% understand is that the most effective way to control world affairs is through the control of the flow of money. Think about it. Countries can't go to war or can't make peace without money. They're dependent upon cash flows. And we think that oftentimes in order to do that, you have to have taxes, which is one of the ways, favorable ways in which governments garner income. But they have another way in which they gain income as well. They borrow from banks, specific banks. That's how places like the United States can, like this year and last year, we have exceeded our income by $1 trillion, so that now our national debt is at $22 trillion. And we might think that's just a factor of bad governance, which it is in many ways, but it also is something that's not accidental. It has a purpose behind it, even if the politicians who are responsible for those decisions don't see it. You have to have money to run a government. Without it, you can't. And we see that all over the world, that when the spigot is turned off, countries collapse. So that when we look at the failings of the Soviet Union, or even Venezuela today, or many other places around the world, we realize it all came down to basically those who have the hand on the spigot decided to either stop it in one way or another and brought it to a quick demise. So how do these people do this? How do these people who have control of the funds do it? And Solomon provided us a very clear and simple answer in Proverbs 22:7. He said, "The rich rule over the poor." He added, "And the borrower is servant to the lender." And the way that they gain control of not just people, but governments on an international level is the rich rule by creating ever-increasing levels of debt so that nations themselves become beholden to bankers in order just to keep the doors of government open. This is the real purpose behind the creation of a number of organizations that are somewhat familiar to those who have spent any time thinking about it. For example, when we have the UN's World Bank, the World Bank's whole role is to provide loans to countries of the world for capital projects. In other words, they want to build a canal or some large bridge or develop something in their nation. Basically, they go to the World Bank to apply for a loan, and if they're given it, the World Bank basically uses it or is supposed to use it in an effort to eliminate poverty. So that we find that in our own locale here, we saw the death of the aluminum industry that used to be a mainstay of our own community. What happened? Well, the World Bank and its friend, the International Monetary Fund, helped fund the development of aluminum plants, mining plants, and processing plants in places like Africa, where they were able to produce that product at a fraction of what we could do here in the States. So that instead of paying people $25 and $30 an hour, as they were doing here in Spokane, they could pay people, $1 a day for the same kind of work, and they were thankful. So the idea behind it is that they're going to help out. But it's interesting, who are the two countries that have received most of the funding from the World Bank? India and China. Now, China, which now has the leading economy of the world, they have surpassed us economically, is also one of the major recipients of funding from the World Bank. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, it's because you're not looking at the real reasons. There's a real reason in causing China to succeed and rise up, because it ties into a greater plan to bring the United States down. It's kind of interesting that I only know of a handful of politicians in America who are saying that the real threat to American sovereignty and prosperity is China. Most of them are running around worrying about the Russians. I mean, Russia is a very crippled nation, which is sinking in its significance and importance and is running out of money and has been for a long time. And yet, that's where we focus all of our attention, when in fact, it is China who is the greatest threat to the United States, our independence and our economy, and who are threatening to exceed us. There's a second group called the International Monetary Fund, another UN organization, and they make international loans to troubled economies. So whereas the World Bank gives money to development of economies, the International Monetary Fund gives it to troubled economies that are really not able to pay their bills. And they come in with these loans, they call them bridge loans, to help them get back on their feet and stabilize their economies. But one of the things that has been the complaint of both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is they don't solve the problems, they aggravate the problems. Because what they end up is creating an economic dependency that many of these nations can never recover from. And it destroys the indigenous industry by redirecting their spending on things like aluminum plants or gold mining or some other thing that basically involves reaping or removing the natural resources from that country and selling them for reproduction in other countries. And it just ensures that they become a colony of wealthier countries and colonies of the major banks. So that the real oppression many people begin to feel now, looking economically, is the very mechanisms that are supposed to be out there feeding and ministering to the needs. Now, you add to that a third organization, which theoretically is separate from the UN because it predates the UN, yet works so closely in concert with the UN, and particularly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It's called the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization oversees the global trade rules that exist between nations. And they have been really key in promoting things like NAFTA or the TPP and ASEAN and all these other trade organizations that are existing around the world. But they basically are supposed to be the arbiters who keep it fair and equal and even. But one of the things we find is that their goal is not focused upon maintaining the wealth or prosperity of any one country. It's really on focusing a redistribution of wealth so that the idea is it's equally shared and all the world basically has the same income, the same lifestyle. But it's interesting, how much can we trust in the integrity of these organizations? There's a lady by the name of Karen Hudis who was she was basically the senior legal counsel for the World Bank for 20 years. And she went public a few years ago with her findings and what she saw. She first reported it within the World Bank and found that she was shuttered and pushed out and then fired because of her revelations. But one of the things she said, the global financial system is dominated by a small group of corrupt, power-hungry figures centered around the privately owned U.S. Federal Reserve. Most people are ignorant of the fact that the Federal Reserve Bank, which handles basically the flow of money in and out of the United States, is not a government organization. Federal kind of misleads. It's a privately owned corporation. It's owned by the very banks that it supposedly supports. That's why when there was a run on the banks, or we had things like Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and others getting in trouble, that it was the Federal Reserve who simply printed more money to refund their finances so that they could stay in business. Because you know what? They were too big to fail. Now, if you bank in a community bank, you wouldn't feel that way. But if you belonged to Chase or one of the other large banks, Bank of America, yeah, for them to fail would be probably catastrophic. And so they were too big to fail. And so we ended up bailing them out so that they could continue to do what they're doing. And talking with people within the lending industry, they said they're back doing the same derivatives that they were doing before. They've simply just gone back and they're doing business as usual. But it says that, she goes on saying, citing an explosive 2011 Swiss study, quote, a network of global corporate control exert a massive amount of influence over the international economy from behind the scenes. The corrupt power grabbers have managed to dominate the media as well. Now, as interesting as these organizations are, there is yet another that's more significant. Because at the very center of this triad of the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization is one of the most unknown, secretive, independent, and the most powerful financial entity in the world. And it has a name that you probably have never heard of before, and that's not by mistake. It's called the Bank of International Settlement. The Bank of International Settlement is located in Basel, Switzerland, and it's housed in a building, interestingly, referred to, now catch this, as the Tower of Basel. Coincidence, I suppose. Coincidence. The BIS is basically controlled by 8 to 10 privately owned central banks. They refer to it as the bank of the central banks of the world. And there are about 150 central banks. In other words, the Federal Reserve is a central bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the Bank of Italy. These are, the Deutsche Bank and so forth. These are banks that really each nation has their own central bank, which oversees the banking industry within their country. And this is the bank of all the international central banks. Their role is really interesting because they handle 95% of all global transactions that take place in the world today. In other words, if the United States wants to send money to some other country, we make our deposits in the Bank of International Settlement, and the Bank of International Settlement takes those monies and deposits in the account of the central bank of that particular nation. And that is 95% of international financial transactions take place like that. They also have a unique ability because they're the ones who do the global economic studies, and they often report on where the economy is going internationally. And part of that is that they decide whether or not or to what degree an individual nation is creditworthy. Now, there are countries whom they may decide they're no longer creditworthy, and so we're not going to extend them money, or we're going to charge them a higher rate of interest because the risk is greater, so that the cost of survival of some governments becomes greater and greater. That's why, despite his terrible political policies, that Maduro in Venezuela will not survive. Because he, like the Soviets and others in the past, have tried to create economic systems, banking systems outside of the BIS, and none of them have been able to survive, because their clout is so great. In fact, what's interesting, the Soviet Union survived because American bankers began doing business with the Soviets through the BIS, and therefore it was invisible and anonymous. Russia, the Soviet Union say, we're doing business with the BIS. In fact, this is the exact same thing during World War II, where American banks were sending money to Germany to fund their war machine through the BIS because Germany would pay such high interest rates. They received stolen goods and monies from many of the Jews and others who were killed by them, and they received them in deposit. And to this day, there's never been an accountability for reasons that may shock you. Today, at this very moment, the BIS holds at least 10% of the monetary reserves that are in the world. In other words, when we say, how do we transition, our gold reserves into dollars in another country, the BIS is the one who makes all those decisions, all those transactions. They control all of that. Whether it be the central banks of the various nations, they do it for the IMF, they do it for the World Bank, they do it for many what they call multilateral institutions. In other words, organizations like corporations, which no longer have national identities or loyalties, but basically do world business around the world. Basically, it serves as the financial agent for the international agreements. It collects information on the global economy and doesn't tell you this, but makes determination who gets how much money at what interest rate. And they serve many times as the lender of last resort to prevent global financial collapse. So that when Italy's economy is falling apart, when Greece's economy is falling apart, ultimately is the Bank of International Settlement that decides, not the German central bank, or the British central bank. It's the BIS who ultimately decides whether or not those funds will be lent to those companies and under what conditions they will receive that money. And if you notice, the rebellion in Greece and Italy in particular is the fact that the bankers are telling them how to run their country. And that becomes the political upheaval. The grassroots revolt are saying, we're being controlled by central bankers. We no longer have control over our own world and our own life. Because what they did, especially when they went to EU, was those governments gave up their ability to print and float their own currency. They can't sell the lira or the franc on the open market and get investors say, we'll pay you so much for your dollars. Those financial calculations, they can't do that anymore. They have to go to the central banks to get euros because their economy has been completely transitioned into a euro economy. And it's not just an accident that the euro is phasing out the 500 euro note. Well, they say it's because criminals can move money so fast and easily. But you see, if you want all money to go through your bank, then anybody who does it in any other way in your mind is a criminal. Essentially, what they're going to allow people to have in their pockets is walking around money. But if they want to do anything financially serious, then they're going to have to rely upon the central banks for their income. It's interesting because basically their goal is to prevent any kind of global financial collapse. But not because they care about you. Basically, they're letting you use their money to pay your bills. There's a historian by the name of Carroll Quigley. He was actually Bill Clinton's mentor when he was going through school, and basically his economic mentor. He's a well-known and highly respected historian and economist. And he wrote the following. He said that the purpose of the BIS, the Bank of International Settlement, was to design a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, acting in concert by secret agreements. It's not surprising that when you go through the list of various people who are involved in so many of these issues, like I noted with somebody like David Rockefeller, that you begin to see the same names popping up over and over and over again. Names that are largely unfamiliar to us because they're not people who want to be in the public limelight. But essentially, they have these agreements that they come to. They have these meetings of which there are no notes and there's no reporting and there's no information because of, in large part, collusion with many within the more powerful media outlets of the world. But basically, what they do is they create this system that really enables them to operate independently without accountability. Because I think the most disturbing thing about the Bank of International Settlement is that, number one, there's no outside accountability. It's never been audited. It will never be audited. They will not even consider an audit. They will not allow anybody who's not part of the organization, and particularly the leadership of the organization, to know anything about their operations and what they have going on. Secondly, its directors and its employees, by law, are exempt from any legal or civil prosecution. They have immunity for lifetime. They are immune for the entirety of their life from any kind of legal action that might be leveled against them. They're totally above the law. So that what we find is we have this organization that highly secretive, unbelievably powerful, and totally independent and immune from any kind of accountability by anybody. And any government that threatens them, what do? They'll just simply say, do you want us to continue to fund your operations or not? The primary goal of the Bank of International Settlement is the prosperity and the preservation and the stability of its member banks, of which there are 8 or 10 that are key. The United States, of course, the Federal Reserve is key. In fact, the president of Chase Manhattan Bank was one of the initial founders of the BIS back in the 1930s. And has always played a key role. David Rockefeller always played a key role in the BIS. But it's also interesting that many people who have been high-profile economists in the United States, like a guy like Paul Volcker, who was the president of the Federal Reserve, or chairman of the Federal Reserve Board for several years, and highly respected. In fact, when we went through the drop in the economy, the recession of 2008, 2009, who did the president call in to advise him? Well, Paul Volcker was asked to come in and help them to ferret out the problem and figure out what was going wrong. But most people don't realize he's also one of the leading board members of the Bank of International Settlement. And he made the statement very simply. He says, a new mechanism is needed for the world financial system. In a globalized world, we should have an international currency. Now, if I say that, it has the weight of toilet paper, But Paul Volcker says that, and we got to realize that here's a guy who was one of the makers of international economic policy. Even the BIS, in one of their own reports, said establishing a single international currency, or perhaps moving to regional currency blocks such as the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi or the yen, is where we need to go. It's interesting because when we talk about things like NAFTA, the EU, the European Union, we talk about the TPP, do you realize that part of the plan with those trade agreements was to do with the rest of the world what they accomplished with Europe? They went to create a European Union, but before they created a European Union, they created a European currency called the euro, which now links all of those countries together in one economy, so that the reality is that if you get paid a euro in France, it has the same buying value as it does in Greece, theoretically. And I remember a friend of mine who was serving a church there in Germany after they made the transition. He says, they told us that the mark, and the Deutschmark and the euro would be equivalent in value. If we have 1 euro, it'll become 1 Deutschmark, it'll become 1 euro. And he said, you know what happened? Suddenly we changed over, and it took me 2 Deutschmarks to be the equivalent purchasing power of 1 euro. In other words, he said, our buying power was cut in half overnight by that one action. Because the idea was we need to bring up the rest of Europe to be on a par so that we all basically share the same economy. And this ultimately is the long-range goal. You start hearing about things about basic guaranteed incomes, which are being floated around the world, that everybody basically gets a check every month, and this, whether you work or not, you're given a check. And they have this idea in a lot of places, they're trying it even here in the United States. Finland did it for a couple of years and stopped doing it because they found that even though they gave people 2,000 euros a month without taxes to use any way they want, and to, if they worked and made more money, that was all the better because their income increased. And what they found is the vast majority of the people just simply contented themselves to live on that gift that they were given every month. It didn't motivate them to do anything more. Anybody who's raised kids understands this. If you give them allowance for doing something, they'll probably do something to get it. If you give them allowance, even if they don't do anything, they're not out of the goodness of their heart saying, can I clean the house? No. Forex, which stands for Foreign Exchange Group, basically said that the idea of going to a single economy is resisted by nations because they said it will lead to a loss of political sovereignty, as monetary interests would need to surpass political interests. In other words, the interest of the bank supersedes the interest of the nation. And so the bankers will play fast and loose, or how they see with the economy of the world, in order to ensure their continuance and the continuance of their wealth, their power, and ultimately their control. So that when I mentioned how that we come to a debt of $22 trillion, which is unfathomable, I remember when one political candidate was crying out, remember that little guy from Texas, was complaining about how the federal deficit was at $4 trillion, and he said it's unsurvivable. And then by the time George Bush left office, it was $10 trillion, or $8 trillion. By the time Obama left, it was $20 trillion. If they had just taken that extra $12 trillion and just divided it amongst us, we would all be living much better right now. But they spend it on important things like infrastructure. I missed it too. I didn't, kind of like the North-South Freeway, it's just, that's coming along really well. My prayer is that when I die, that the free will be done, and when they take my body to the cemetery, part of the journey will be to drive the completed North-South Freeway. And you laughed. When I came here in 83, they had been working on it since 73. And now what are we at? 2019? Anyway. But you have to understand that it is all about the money. In fact, the Economic Policy Institute made this statement. Trade agreements like NAFTA, like TPP, which fortunately we're out of, and even within the European Union, he says trade agreements have almost nothing to do with free trade. They give to the already affluent and take from the rest, and then act surprised when it happens. Their real purpose is to insulate the corporate entities that are represented under those trade agreements so they will continue to prosper, and even though it has a deteriorating effect upon the countries like the United States. So that when many people do studies of the economic downturns in America and the struggles, there's just, I was looking at charts of this, and I didn't have time to throw them all up here, but you can just see from the moment we went into NAFTA, the average American incomes began to drop. The standard of living began to drop. At the same time, while the corporations were beginning to become wealthier and wealthier all the time. And that isn't by accident. But as I look to the future, I see, 4 simple steps or things that are going to happen economically that I think a single international currency is a done deal already. I mean, whether you believe it or not, I just guarantee you that we're already, we're de facto, we're already there. We already have one world economy that's controlled by one central entity. But it's just a matter of converting it. Whether we go to first regional currencies, because there was talk of a regional currency called the Amero, which would have served for all of North America. Basically, they're predicting within 15 years that China and all of South Asia will have one currency that will serve as it does in the EU. It's just a matter of time to see what happens, whether they shift to regional currencies and then eventually move further to a centralized currency. Sooner or later, I suspect in my lifetime that we will see us coming to a international currency of one kind or another. They may allow you to keep some walking around money, but when it comes down to the real issues of purchasing and buying, it's going to have to be done in these international currencies. Secondly, it's going to be digitally controlled, much like it is today. I shared last week that only 8% of currency actually exists. The rest, the other 92% is in digital form around the world. But one of the things that had people excited was the Bitcoin idea, the idea of blockchain banking, and basically they're creating money out of nothing. I had somebody call me up saying, "What do you think about investing in this?" I said, "Well, what am I investing in? If I buy a Bitcoin, what am I buying?" And they said, "Well, it's going up in value." Yes, but if it goes up that quick, won't it come down that quick? One of the things I think most people don't understand is that Bitcoins went so high and suddenly they just plummeted in value. What happened? People like the BIS bought a bunch of Bitcoins and then dumped them on the world markets, and it drove the price down. That's how they do it. It's how George Soros made his millions. He bankrupted countries by buying up all their currency and then shorting it, and the currency collapsed, and then he waited till it came back in value, and then he reaped the benefits. It's the same idea. Bitcoin will never be viable, because at the same time they're doing that, all of the central banks have been devising their own blockchain forms of banking that are accountable to them. And it's interesting because I remember Bill Gates saying, well, the problem with Bitcoin or blockchain banking is it's not attributable. In other words, what he meant is there's nothing solid behind them like the Bank of International Settlements. So there have been all sorts of efforts to kind of get around the BIS and the central banks like blockchain, but in the end of the day, they don't have any attribution. They're not attributable. You can't basically say it's guaranteed by this and that. And so all they needed to do is just go in the market. For them, spending hundreds of millions of dollars is nothing to buy up a bunch of Bitcoins and other forms of cryptocurrency, and then at the right moment just simply dumping it on the market and driving the price down as people panic to get what they can get out of their coins. And suddenly it bottoms out. Because at the end of the day, it's all thin air anyway. It's all just ones and O's, doesn't really exist in the real world. But I think that's going to move beyond that from the digital form to ultimately a personalized way of doing business. And that's something I touched on briefly last week was international internet IPv6. IPv4 is what we operated on for a long time. The problem with IPv4 is it can only get 4 billion addresses. In other words, your computer, your phone, everything has a different address, and you could only get so many of those. But when they went to IP6, which is in process right now, it moved it from 4 billion to 340 trillion different IP addresses. In fact, there are 100,000 IP addresses available now per square meter of the earth. Every 3 by 3 square, water and land on the planet Earth has available for that space 100,000 IP addresses. So that, as one writer put it, he says, each and every device will get an IP address, be it your computer, phone, toaster, wristwatch, fridge, door, water heater, car, alarm clock, oven, and then I added, and you. How can you track the population of the earth? By giving every person on the earth, all you need is a mere 7 billion addresses to every person who has their own address. Maybe stored in some kind of RFID chip on your hand or your forehead. But I love this statement. The one article I was reading, he concluded by saying, the internet will no longer be about information, but about things. You know what you are? In their mind, you are a thing. It's no longer about information. It's about controlling everything, identifying, tracking, following, rating, valuing, selecting, sorting, sifting, everything on the planet, including the humanity that lives here. Now, I just want to throw a teaser out there. Next week will be the end of this series. And some of you are saying, thank God. But what I want to talk about next week is the fate of America. It's the most common question. Well, where does America fit into all of this? And I used to say, well, I don't see America in the biblical events of the end times. I've changed my mind. In my own reading over the last few months, I've come to recognize some things I think that do speak very directly to the fate of America. And you may want to be here for that. Let's pray. Father, I ask that you would help us to comprehend and absorb this information. I know that it must feel like to many people like they're drinking water out of a fire hose. So much data, so much information, so many quotes and statements and figures and facts, Lord. And I recognize that, Lord. You know how hard I've tried to simplify the information and consolidate it, and yet the one thing is that confusion is of the devil, and the devil tries to keep us confused so we can't figure out what's going on and just automatically assume that it's out of our control. Lord, I pray that you'd guide us, and particularly next week as I talk about what we can do, the way that we can respond to these events in a way that would be redemptive. I pray, God, that you'd give us wisdom and grace as we process these things in Jesus' name. Amen.